After 2 decades of marriage, a husband abandons his wife for a younger woman. But what she did left him shocked. Dear viewers, welcome to our channel. Subscribe to receive more stories every day. Maria stood in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the counter. Her husband, Richard, had just delivered the news that would change her life forever. "I want you gone, Maria," he said coldly, his eyes avoiding hers. "It's over. I've met someone else, someone younger. She makes me feel alive in a way you haven't in years." Maria felt the air leave her lungs as if the ground beneath her feet had vanished. 40 years old, after 2 decades of building a life together, supporting his every whim, raising their 2 children. This was her reward? A man in his early 50s, with the success they had both worked for, casting her aside like she was nothing. The tears she had promised herself not to cry began to fall. "But where will I go?" Her voice barely broke through the thick tension in the room. Richard waved his hand dismissively. "I don't care. That's not my problem anymore." The words cut deeper than any physical blow could. Richard had always been a bit self-centered, but this cruelty was new, raw. Maria had seen the signs, the secretive texts, late nights at the office, and his sudden interest in fitness, but she had told herself it was just a phase. Now, the reality slapped her in the face with a force she wasn't prepared for. "By tomorrow I want you out," he continued, as though he were giving her the weather forecast. "I've already spoken to the lawyer. The house is mine. You'll get some money, a settlement. But you need to leave." Maria's mind raced. The house was everything to her. They had built it together, brick by brick, after years of struggle. She had been with Richard when he was nothing, supporting him through every failed venture until one finally took off. And now, just as they had reached the peak of success, he was replacing her with a newer model. She couldn't believe it. That night, Maria barely slept. The walls of the house, once filled with laughter and warmth, felt cold and foreign. Her children were grown and living their own lives, unaware of the storm brewing at home. And Richard? He had gone out, likely with this new woman, to celebrate his newfound freedom. The next morning, Maria packed a single suitcase, her heart heavy with the weight of betrayal. As she stood at the front door, she glanced around the house one last time, trying to burn every detail into her memory. The polished hardwood floors, the smell of lavender from the garden, the sound of wind chimes that hung near the window. It was her home, and yet it had never felt so far away. With nowhere else to go, Maria drove to the one place she hadn't thought of in years: her family's old countryside estate. The property had been left untouched since her father passed, a forgotten relic of her childhood. The house was barely standing and the land overgrown, but it was all she had. As she pulled up to the long-abandoned gate, the memories came flooding back. The summers she spent here as a child, running through the fields with her father, her mother's voice calling them in for dinner. It had been decades since she'd returned, but there was something comforting about the solitude. The estate, though run down, still carried an air of majesty. Her father had once been a successful businessman, and the land reflected that wealth. But after his death, the family had drifted apart, and the estate had fallen into disrepair. Maria had never given it much thought. Life with Richard had been too busy, too consuming. Maria stepped out of the car and walked toward the front door, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the silence. She fumbled with the old key, surprised that it still worked. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, dusty interior. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and the furniture was covered in white sheets, like ghosts from her past. She wandered through the rooms, each one filled with memories she had long since buried. The study, where her father used to sit for hours, reading or going through paperwork. The living room, where her family gathered during the holidays. Everything was just as she remembered, yet time had left its mark on every surface. As she reached the old office, she paused. The door was slightly ajar, something she hadn't noticed before. Curiosity piqued. Maria pushed it open and stepped inside. Her father's desk sat in the corner, still covered with papers and documents, as if he had just stepped out for a moment. She approached it, running her fingers over the dusty surface, a wave of nostalgia washing over her. In the bottom drawer, she found something unexpected, an old weathered deed, hidden beneath a stack of letters. Her heart skipped a beat as she unfolded it, reading the fine print. It was a deed to the land, but it wasn't just the family estate. It included something much more: shares in a large company that her father had invested in years ago. A company that Maria had never heard of. As she read further, her eyes widened in disbelief. The shares were worth millions. Her father had left her a fortune, hidden away in the form of these investments. And the company. It was a major player in the real estate industry, the very industry in which Richard now thrived. Maria sat down, the weight of the discovery sinking in. Her father had been a man of vision, and this investment had paid off in ways she could never have imagined. But Richard had no idea. He had left her for dead, assuming she had nothing, while this treasure had been waiting for her all along. She leaned back in the chair, a slow smile spreading across her face. For the first time since the betrayal, Maria felt something she hadn't expected: hope. Richard had thrown her out, thinking he was ridding himself of a burden. But in reality, he had unleashed a force he couldn't control. Maria wasn't just going to survive, she was going to thrive. Maria wasted no time. The next morning, she sat in her father's old office, scanning through the paperwork. The shares in the real estate company were legitimate and had appreciated significantly over the years. Her father had been wise, investing in a company that was now one of the biggest players in the industry, and Maria was now one of the largest shareholders. Armed with this knowledge, Maria began to formulate a plan. The first step was to contact a lawyer, someone who could help her navigate the legal maze of claiming her inheritance. The process would be complicated, but Maria was determined. She had been underestimated for far too long. Her lawyer, James, was a sharp and experienced man in his late 40s, with a reputation for handling complex cases. When Maria explained the situation, he was immediately intrigued. "This is a game changer," he said, leaning back in his chair as he examined the deed. "Your father left you a substantial fortune. We'll need to go through the proper channels to claim it, but once you do, you'll be in a very powerful position." Maria nodded, her mind already racing. James's words echoed in Maria's mind as she left his office. Powerful position. It had been so long since she felt any sense of control over her life, and now she held the keys to something much greater than just personal survival. This was a chance not only to rebuild but to create a new life on her terms. Over the next few weeks, Maria immersed herself in legal processes and financial education. She hadn't been heavily involved in business matters before, always letting Richard take the reins while she handled their home life. But now everything had changed. She needed to understand every detail of her inheritance and how to leverage it properly. James connected her with financial advisors, and Maria became a student of business strategy, investments, and corporate governance. She was a quick learner, driven by a fire she hadn't realized she possessed. Her days at the countryside estate, once filled with sorrow and loneliness, became a whirlwind of activity. She restored parts of the house, making it livable again, though she kept its rustic charm. It became a symbol of her new life, a sanctuary of empowerment rather than the prison of memories it had once been. Every morning, Maria would sit in her father's old office, combing through more of his documents, learning not just about the fortune he had left her, but also about his sharp mind for business. Her admiration for him deepened with every discovery. He had seen the potential in the real estate company when it was just a small firm, betting on it before anyone else had. Now, she was walking in his footsteps, ready to carry on his legacy. One evening, after a long day of meetings and research, Maria received a phone call that shook her to her core. It was Richard. "Maria, we need to talk." His voice was different now, softer, almost hesitant. "What could we possibly have to talk about, Richard?" Maria's voice was steady, but inside, her heart raced. She hadn't spoken to him since the day he'd thrown her out. "I made a mistake," he began, and Maria could hear the exhaustion in his tone. "This woman, the one I left you for. It's not what I thought. Everything is falling apart. The business is in trouble, and I don't know what to do." Maria leaned back in her chair, suppressing the urge to laugh. The irony of the situation was almost too much to handle. The man who had discarded her was now crawling back, realizing that the grass wasn't greener on the other side. "I don't see how this concerns me," Maria replied, her voice calm but icy. Richard hesitated, as if unsure how to proceed. I was hoping you'd consider coming back. We were a good team once, Maria. We built this together, and I know I made mistakes, but maybe we can work through them." Maria's mind flashed to the months of betrayal, the way he had belittled her, and finally discarded her. The pain was still fresh, but so was her newfound strength. She wasn't the same woman he had cast aside. She was stronger now, wiser. "You threw me away like I was nothing," Maria said, her voice thick with the memories of that day. "And now that you're in trouble, you come crawling back. You don't get to make me part of your mess anymore, Richard." Silence hung on the line, and Maria could almost picture him sitting in their old house, defeated, realizing the full weight of his actions. "I didn't know what I was doing," he finally whispered. "I thought I needed something else, something new. But I was wrong. I know that now." Maria felt a pang of pity, but it quickly faded. Richard's regrets didn't erase the months of pain he had caused. She wasn't going to let him back into her life so easily. Not after everything. "I'm not coming back, Richard," she said firmly. "I have my own life now, and I'm going to build it without you." Before he could respond, Maria hung up the phone, her hands trembling slightly from the confrontation. It had been hard, but it was necessary. She wasn't the same Maria who had depended on Richard for everything. She was her own person now, and she didn't need him. The next day, Maria met with James to finalize the transfer of her inheritance. The shares were now officially hers, and Maria found herself in an unfamiliar but exhilarating position. She was one of the largest shareholders in Richard's company. What made it even more satisfying was that Richard had no idea she was involved. Over the next few weeks, Maria slowly began to maneuver herself within the company. She remained anonymous, working through James and other intermediaries to build influence and gain insights into the company's operations. It wasn't long before she discovered the extent of Richard's problems. The company was bleeding money, thanks to a series of poor decisions made in the wake of their separation. His new partner had led him down a disastrous path, siphoning funds and leaving the business teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. But Maria wasn't just going to let the company collapse. No, she had a better plan. One afternoon, during a particularly tense board meeting, the company's executives were discussing possible ways to save the business. Richard, looking haggard and defeated, was leading the conversation, but it was clear he had no real solutions. That's when Maria made her move. Through her proxies, she arranged a buyout offer, a lifeline for the company. The terms were simple. The business would be saved, but it would come under new ownership. Richard's control would be stripped away, and the company would be restructured. Richard, desperate and with no other options, agreed to the deal, unaware that the offer had come from his ex-wife. The day the papers were signed, Maria decided it was time for the final reveal. She walked into the boardroom, the heels of her shoes echoing on the polished floor. The room fell silent as she approached the head of the table, where Richard sat, his face pale with shock. "Maria," he stammered, his eyes wide. She smiled, a quiet confidence radiating from her. "Yes, Richard. It's me." The room remained deathly quiet as Maria laid the final papers on the table, her eyes never leaving his. "I'm the new owner," she said calmly. "And from now on, this company will be run the way it should have been all along." Richard stared at her, disbelief etched into every line of his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Maria waited for a moment, savoring the silence before turning and walking out of the room. As she left the building, a weight lifted from her shoulders. She had done it. She had taken back control of her life and more. Richard had underestimated her, just as he had underestimated so many things. But now Maria was free, and for the first time in her life, she was in complete control. With the company firmly in her hands, Maria set out to transform it into something far greater than it had ever been under Richard's control. She took over the leadership role herself, relying on the skills she had learned and the team of professionals she had gathered during the months of preparation. Her first move was to restructure the business from the inside out, cutting the dead weight and implementing strategies her father had taught her through his old papers. The company quickly stabilized, then began to grow under her leadership. Her employees, once unsure of this new, unexpected owner, began to rally behind her, impressed by her clear vision and ability to make tough decisions. Maria had thought the thrill of victory would fade, but as the months went on, it only grew stronger. She had built something of her own, something that no one, not Richard, not anyone, could take away from her. Months passed, and Maria's transformation into a formidable business leader was undeniable. Her company not only recovered but flourished under her leadership, growing faster and more sustainably than it ever had under Richard. She modernized the operations, invested in new technologies, and forged strategic partnerships that Richard could never have imagined. The media began to take notice of the sudden turnaround in the real estate company, and whispers of a new CEO at the helm started spreading. Maria kept her profile low, preferring to let her actions speak louder than any publicity. But word inevitably leaked out. She was the mastermind behind the company's revival. When the news finally broke, Richard couldn't avoid it any longer. He was no longer involved in the business, having been forced out after the buyout, but the headlines haunted him. Woman kicked out by husband now owns his company, or Maria's revenge, from betrayed wife to business tycoon. Richard's pride had been shattered. He had lost everything, the business he had built, his home, and now even his public image. Meanwhile, Maria's rise was meteoric. The world admired her resilience, her intelligence, and the quiet power she had wielded in taking back control of her life. But Maria wasn't interested in revenge for revenge's sake. She had no intention of seeing Richard suffer beyond what was necessary. In fact, her success was all the satisfaction she needed. Watching Richard's slow downfall, she realized that the power she once believed he held over her had been an illusion. The real power had always been hers. She just hadn't seen it until now. One evening, as Maria stood on the balcony of her new city apartment, far from the quiet countryside estate where she had begun her comeback, she received a call she hadn't expected. It was Richard again. She hesitated for a moment before answering, her emotions a mixture of curiosity and mild annoyance. "Maria, I wanted to apologize." His voice sounded strained, tired, like a man who had been defeated by his own arrogance. "I've lost everything. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I had to say it." Maria listened in silence. She had imagined this moment many times, him begging for forgiveness, for some form of absolution, but now that it was here, she felt nothing but pity. She didn't need his apology. Her success was her closure. "I appreciate you saying that," Maria finally replied. "But I've moved on, Richard. You should too." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I wish I had seen what I had before it was too late," Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You were the best thing in my life, and I threw it away." Maria closed her eyes, feeling the cool breeze of the night on her skin. "Yes, you did. But that's in the past now." With that, she ended the call, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't anticipated. The weight of Richard's betrayal had been lifted long ago, replaced by her newfound strength and independence. She didn't need him to regret his choices for her to feel whole. She was complete on her own. As the months turned into years, Maria's company continued to grow, and she became a respected figure in the business world. Her story of betrayal and triumph became an inspiration to many women who had faced similar struggles. But to Maria, the real victory wasn't in the wealth or the fame. It was in the quiet moments of peace she found in her new life, knowing that she had built something beautiful from the ruins of her past. And Richard? He faded into obscurity, just another man who had underestimated the strength of a woman he thought he could break. Maria's story was now hers alone, one of resilience, power, and the unwavering belief that she could rise again, no matter how far she had been pushed. Dear viewers, thank you for watching. If you like this story, please subscribe to our channel to receive more stories every day. Share with us what you think of this story.